Hi, and welcome back to English 101. In this video, we're going to talk about elements of research writing in preparation for your research paper, which will be due soon. First, let's talk about introductions and conclusions. So in academic and professional writing, the main purpose of an introduction is to tell the reader exactly what to expect from the rest of the paper. The reason we do this is because, as you've probably found starting to do research for your paper, it can be difficult to know which articles are actually going to be useful for the things that you're writing about in your paper. Sometimes you find a paper and you think it might be helpful, and then you end up reading through it and you realize that it isn't exactly what you were looking for. It isn't actually going to be helpful in the research that you're doing in the paper that you're writing. So the reason we have these introductions is to let anybody who's reading our research paper know exactly what we're planning to talk about and exactly what our thesis is, what we're trying to prove in this paper. The main purpose of a thesis statement is to tell the reader what your opinion on the matter is. The introduction introduces the concept, tells them what you're talking about, and the thesis tells them what your opinion is. Sometimes you have your own answer to your research question. Sometimes your thesis is just that you think each of the answers you talk about are worth considering. Sometimes your thesis is that one particular person who's already written about a subject is the most correct on the topic. Any of these can be a good thesis statement, but you want to be clear about what your thesis statement is. You want to tell your readers exactly what the answer what you think the answer is to your research question. As far as the conclusion goes, a lot of people think the conclusion is essentially just a restatement of the introduction paragraph, but it's not. The purpose of the concluding section is not simply to summarize, but to remind your reader what conclusion you drew. So it's going to be more similar to your thesis statement than to the introductory paragraph. The introductory paragraph should introduce the topic. It should give some general background information about the topic, about your research question, so that the reader knows where we are. And then the thesis statement will tell them your opinion on the matter. And then the conclusion will tell them what conclusion you drew, as well as telling the reader why the topic is important. So you should apply your conclusion to a bigger picture. So for example, maybe I'm interested in marine biology, and so I'm writing a paper about different species of kelp in the ocean and what they do for the ocean. In my concluding paragraph, I should tell the reader why this is important, why this applies to a bigger picture. So I might say something like, oh, well, this one particular kind of kelp is actually really important. You should be interested in this topic and you should care about it, because this kind of kelp provides, 25% of all of the oxygen in the world, or something like that. Tell the reader why this is important. Let's talk a little bit about arguments as well. You should be acknowledging arguments that you find in the articles that you've researched, the articles that you're going to be citing in the end of your paper. And you should be analyzing the strength of those arguments. So what is an argument? What makes an argument strong? Well, communication's full of arguments. I don't mean the heated disagreement fighting type. An argument is just communication used to clarify or to prove or to assert something. Two people can have an argument, but think of this as going back and forth testing the strength of an idea. So let's look at an example. There are two parts of an argument: the claim, which is the point being made, and the evidence, which supports the claim. So look at the following argument, which I encountered this morning in a conversation with my roommate. Me, how do you sleep? Him, great, I got 9 hours of sleep. So this is an argument in that he's making a claim and he has evidence which supports his claim, right? His claim is that he slept great. His evidence, he got 9 hours of sleep. An argument can be strong or weak depending on its evidence. Is getting 9 hours of sleep good evidence to support my roommate's claim that he slept great? Yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of the strength of your evidence is going to kind of depend on people's preconceived notions of certain ideas. If we, as a human race, didn't already know that we need about 8 or 9 hours of sleep a night in order to get really good, meaningful sleep, if we hadn't done that research, or if we didn't just know based off of experience, then it would be more difficult to know whether this claim is strong or weak, right? Oh, is 9 hours of sleep good? I don't know. So I don't know if this argument is strong or not. But because we know that 9 hours, 8 or 9 is kind of the amount that we need in order to function well as human beings, we know that this is a strong argument because of the preconceived notions we already have on the topic. Note that a claim of an argument is not always clearly stated. So consider the following argument I encountered on a paper towel dispenser in a public restroom once. Paper towels equal trees. So this is an argument, even though it isn't clearly stating their their claim for the argument. What is the claim? Well, we can assume based off of where this sign is and what it says, the claim is something along the lines of, be conscious of the amount of paper towels you use. Don't use too many paper towels. What's the evidence? Well, paper towels come from trees, right? We don't want to chop down all our trees, and paper towels come from those. So, make sure you're using them sparingly. You only use as many as you need. This is an argument even though the claim isn't clearly stated. Is it a strong or weak argument? It kind of depends on our preconceived notions, right? Some people would think, no, trees are a renewable resource. It's okay to cut them down. The issue isn't in the using of paper towels, but in the reforestation, making sure we're planting new trees every time we chop them down. Or some people might say, yeah, absolutely, global warming's on the rise. We need to be conscious of the amount of oxygen producing living things we have on the earth. So, maybe we shouldn't be using any paper towels at all. And so the strength is going to depend on those preconceived notions that we have. There are different ways to analyze evidence, however, instead of just based off of what people's beliefs might be about the topic. And this is where analyzation of evidence comes in. So we have different kinds of evidence that we might use for an argument, right? There are 3 main categories that evidence falls into: authority, emotion, and logic. When talking about these types of evidence, we usually use the Greek terms ethos, pathos, and logos, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So ethos, pathos, and logos are Greek words that we still use in rhetoric to describe arguments. They describe the evidence one might use to support their claim, right? So ethos is evidence that points to an authority figure. Pathos is evidence that appeals to the audience's emotions. Pathos is the same root that words like empathy come from. Things that have to do with emotion, right? And logos obviously has the same root that we use to get to the word logic in modern English. And logos is evidence that appeals to an audience's logic or reason. Consider a mother trying to get her daughter to eat vegetables. She might try 3 different approaches. One that points to an authority figure, one that appeals to emotion, and one that appeals to reason, right? So an ethos evidence for why one should eat their vegetables might be, Spider-Man eats all of his vegetables. This is an appeal to authority because superheroes or maybe Santa Claus are seen as authority figures to kids, right? They're seen as like this person who knows what the difference between right and wrong, right? Santa Claus judges between a naughty and a nice child. A superhero puts bad guys away. They know the difference between good and bad. And so if a superhero says it's good to eat vegetables, if a superhero does eat vegetables, as a kid, that might be a pretty strong piece of evidence, right? As an adult, it might not be a very strong piece of evidence. Why? Because we know that Spider-Man isn't actually real. You'll see a lot of times online when people are trying to use evidence that points to an authority figure in order to make a claim, except that authority figure maybe never said what they say they're saying. That makes evidence pretty weak. Or maybe the authority figure doesn't actually exist. Or maybe the authority figure is an authority, but on something completely different. If Neil deGrasse Tyson got on, Instagram and he was like, all kids should be eating their vegetables. Sure, maybe it's true. Maybe kids should be eating their vegetables. But is he the best authority to speak on the matter? Probably not. He's an astrophysicist. He's not a dietitian or a specialist in early childhood development, which we might say are our kind of top authority figures for evidence on whether or not we should be eating our vegetables. Pathos, so an appeal to emotion. Maybe the mom says, I worked hard to cook these vegetables. If you don't eat them, I'm going to be so sad. This is an appeal to emotion, right? She's trying to provide evidence that makes the child feel emotional, that makes the child feel an emotional drive to do something, to believe something, that eating her vegetables is good, right? Now, maybe this is strong evidence for a kid. For an adult, it kind of depends. We definitely see this kind of argumentation in modern politics all the time and in modern media. People who are, instead of looking at evidence that maybe is more logically developed or that points to some authority figure who's done a lot of research and knows what's going on with this topic, people will say, oh, well, you're a bad person if you believe that my opponent should become president of the United States, or my opponent is a bad person because, they hate this group of people, or whatever. They're trying to make you feel emotional connection to the topic so that you'll believe their evidence, that you'll believe their claim. Pathos is generally considered the weakest kind of evidence because it isn't based on fact or logic or experience or experimentation. And emotion can be used in any direction at all to try to manipulate people to believe anything. So it's not usually the strongest evidence for an argument. So in your research articles, when you're researching, you're reading these different articles online, if you find some appeal to emotion in there and you're like, this isn't very strong evidence for the claim they're making, say that in your research paper. It's totally fine to bring up an argument. And then as you're analyzing the evidence that these people have used, if you think that some evidence is weak, you can say that in your paper. You can say, these people used this evidence for their argument to prove that their claim is true, but it uses an appeal to emotion, which isn't founded in fact or logic, and so it's not a very strong argument to prove what they're claiming, right? Finally, we've got logos, an appeal to logic. So maybe the mom wants to appeal to her daughter's logic to convince her to eat vegetables. So she says, eating your vegetables will keep you healthy. This is logic because we know that eating vegetables helps you stay healthy. And so if somebody wants to say, stay healthy, we can say, if you want to stay healthy, then you should eat vegetables because we know if you eat vegetables, you'll be more healthy. This maybe isn't a great argument for kids. It's not a very strong argument because kids haven't developed senses of logic yet, understanding of how if A leads to B and you want B, then you should do A, right? They can't quite grasp that yet. But as adults, this should be good evidence for us, right? If we know for sure that A leads to B and we want B, then we know that we need A, right? So these are 3 examples of the kinds of evidence that you might encounter as you research and the kinds of evidence that you should be analyzing in your research paper. So I've asked that you find 5 academic articles or other reputable sources that talk about the subject that you're discussing. I ask that you try to present a few different views, a few different answers to your research question, and I want you to analyze the evidence that these views have. So hypothetically, maybe my research question is, which kind of algae is the one that we should be protecting the most? Which one should we put most protective efforts toward keeping around? And so I analyze a bunch of different algaes. I analyze these academic sources that talk about different algaes and what they do for the environment. And then I say, this argument says this algae is best, except their evidence is really weak. They use this appeal to emotion, or they use this appeal to authority, except this person isn't an authority on marine biology, so they don't really know. Or I might say, oh yeah, this argument uses an appeal to logic. They have this evidence and this evidence, these statistics. And so it's a strong argument because it's got a lot of strong evidence, right? So this is the kind of stuff you should be writing in your research paper. Logical fallacies. This is the last thing I wanted to talk about as far as evidence and claims go. There are a lot of common ways that people try to manipulate us into believing things without any real evidence. There's a really great list on Purdue OWL, and I've put a link in the slides if you're following along on the slides. I'll give you a couple examples. There's the straw man argument, which essentially, if 2 people are arguing on opposite sides of an issue, if one person says, oh, well, my opponent thinks this and this and this, and that's wrong, but the opponent hasn't actually made any of those claims, that's a straw man argument, because they're arguing against this kind of fake person, this person made out of straw, so to speak. They build up this fake person, and then it's really easy to knock down that fake person because they aren't fighting back, right? They're saying, oh yeah, well, this person thinks this and this and this. Instead of arguing against the real person, they've created a fake person that's easy to knock down because it doesn't have any actual beliefs grounded in reason, right? Other arguments, the if everyone is doing it, the bandwagon argument. You see this a lot in terms of like ethics. People will say, oh, well, 7 of the 8 billion people on Earth believe this thing is right, and 7 billion people can't be wrong. Well, 7 billion people could be wrong. There are lots of instances of times when everybody on Earth believed something was totally scientific fact, and then it turned out to be totally wrong. There was a time when everybody on the Earth believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and the sun rotated around it and all the stars. And now we know that's not true, right? 100 years ago, it was a scientific fact that if a human being went over 100 miles an hour, they would die. They thought this was true. They thought humans just could not stand going that fast. And now my sister goes that fast on the freeway all the time, and she's just fine. Anyway, so look through this list of logical fallacies. It'll help you avoid making logical fallacies yourself so that your argument can be really strong. And it'll help you see when these logical fallacies are showing up in communication around you, in the media that you view, or in the academic papers that you're analyzing for your research paper. Finally, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer. And good luck writing your research papers. I look forward to reading them.